Mhm. Welcome everybody. Welcome to session 2 of the Future Leaders in Planning program. Woohoo! Woo! We made it to week 2. This week's session is planning and practice. You can go to the next slide. So today's speaker will have Elliot Lewis and Mary Weber, who are both assistant analysts here at CMAP. And then we'll have Dr. Kate Lowe, who's associate professor with UIC's College of Urban Planning and Public Administration. Next slide. And so on today's agenda, we'll spend some time doing the homework share back. We will introduce you into the Planners Toolkit, which is basically just an introduction into what planners do and some planning related fields. Then we'll have a presentation by Dr. Kate Lowe, and then we'll conclude with a reflection and then talk about the homework for next week. So homework share back. So you all should have received a link in the chat from last week and also via email a link to the homework assignment. So if you all remember, for those of you who attended last week's session, we had Tanika Johnson with the Folded Map Project come and talk about her work doing map twins and showing inequity across Chicago and how segregated Chicago is. So this homework assignment consisted of you picking a map twin. It could have been where you live or just any area on the map, and pretty much sharing your observations based on those 2 locations. So I'll open it up for someone or anyone to jump in and share what you learned, any observations that you made, the different neighborhoods that you looked at. And then if anyone actually visited the place, that would be nice too. Share about your visit or if you have any plans to visit in the future. Kennedy raised a hand. Kennedy, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, I did the West Pullman neighborhood, which is where I live, and that's like 119th and Halsted. And I compared that to, I guess that's Lincoln Park, and that's Halsted and Division. And I saw a lot of similarities, and I was like very surprised because like the neighborhoods, their property values are different, but it was like a lot of trash, and it was a garbage can in the area, but it still is a lot of trash. But one difference that I saw was how there was a Target, a Mariano's, and a gas station, and this place called West Marine, like right in the neighborhood on Division and Halsted, but like where my neighborhood is, it was like a bunch of small convenience stores, but no like real large store. And that really stuck out to me. Like there were some similarities, but there were some differences as well.
Thank you, Kennedy, for sharing that. I think we have Dominique. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I was actually looking at, I didn't get a chance to fill out the information, but I was actually looking at the differences between the north end of Western and the south end of Western. I actually used to live up by like Albany Park, and I was honestly looking a little bit more towards like Logan Square area. And there was a lot more diversity in the neighborhood of Logan Square in comparison to further south on Western near Pilsen. There was like a comic book shop. It was right next to the Blue Line, so you could get really anywhere you needed to go in Chicago. And there was like plenty of different like little bakeries and things like that around the area. In comparison to further south, it was essentially a food desert. There's really like there's like a couple of like like a Wingstop, fast food areas and stuff like that, but not a lot in terms of grocery stores or in terms of quality grocery stores, aside from, I think there was one, which was Pete's Produce.
Okay. Thanks for sharing that, Dominique. I think there's a lot of similarities where on the South Side, you may not see as many grocery stores in certain areas. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Will Snyder, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, so I wasn't able to find my map twin, unfortunately, but so I jumped to just like different parts of Chicago. I was trying to find like 2 addresses that would match and had similarities. And so I did 1843 North Kedzie versus South Kedzie. And the biggest difference was the North address was Jefferson Park area. So pretty trendy. You have a lot of higher, higher value homes with a lot of amenities around them, like parks, transit access, bicycle lanes, and like well-paved streets and everything. And South was not the case. The property was itself blighted next to a vacant lot with dumping. The street was in pretty good condition, but the sidewalks didn't look like they were in too good of condition. And, no real access to food besides like a little corner store that probably doesn't have many fresh food options. So yeah, and I went on Zillow too. And I mean, night and day in terms of kind of the home values of the homes themselves and then the homes around them. So.
Thanks for sharing, Will.
Thank you.
Let's see, what do we have? Anyone else? Aaron.
Hi, so I'll be really quick. I did a property on North Ashland and South Ashland, and what really, really struck me and hit home was, so on, South Ashland, you had the, storefront liquor shop, and then on North Ashland, it was like a wine and liqueur shop. And so that really just in like a screenshot right there was very big. Like that's, I want to say a quintessential difference, but like that sums up a good chunk of it.
Thank you, Aaron. Allie.
I also did North and South Ashland, and something I noticed is on the north side, there was lots of like bike racks, really nice like sidewalks. But on the south side, there was actually a man like tying his bike to a street pole. So it's kind of like ironic that they had them in the north side, no one was using them, and then in the south they didn't have them, and it was obviously something that was needed.
I have a question. Was anybody shocked by what they found when they were doing the comparisons? I'm seeing heads shake. Not really. So you were expecting this. Does anyone want to unmute and maybe explain why they weren't surprised by this? Okay.
What about the benefit of being observant? What's the benefit of being observant, even if you're not a planner? If you're somebody who doesn't live in this neighborhood, driving by and seeing that, this neighborhood looks very different from your neighborhood or the neighborhoods that you maybe go to for your social life or where you go to school. Why is that so important? We got some hands raised. Greg? You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, you need to kind of, I guess, like, understand the differences or like what things are working in one place that might not be like contributing in another place, if that makes sense. And then like kind of understand the difference in development so you can be more like empathetic to like people in other parts of the city.
That's a good point, Greg. Thanks for sharing that. I have Prescott. Prescott, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. We can't hear you. I see you're unmuted, but we can't hear you. Let's see. Anyone else want to go ahead and unmute themselves and explain?
I think I fixed it.
Okay, we can hear you now.
Okay. One of the benefits of being observant in terms of the disparities in areas that you frequent, that even if you don't live there, would be, I feel like, because like, even if you don't live in one area, the disparities and conditions that one place is in can start to bleed out into other areas. And also because those things that impact that one area are usually big hot button issues with society as a whole. Like if there's a really big panhandling or homeless population and there's dilapidated buildings and bridges in one area, it doesn't mean that there's probably not, vacant, that maybe there's vacant space that isn't being occupied because of wealth gaps and barriers in your area and infrastructure that isn't being examined. So the conditions that cause one place to look a certain way may be a risk posed to other areas, and all of them should be treated equally, even if they don't have the same outward appearance.
You are absolutely correct. I agree with you in that response. Aaron posted in the chat, you need to identify the problem to know that there is one. Can you expand on that, Aaron?
Yeah, so, what I say is if you don't have the information to ask the question, how do you know to ask it? So you need to be able to see and observe there's a difference to start the ball rolling of, oh, this isn't quite right.
Mm-hmm. I see Kevin's hand raised.
Yeah, so I think it's important to kind of go into those areas and observe it, to see to compare to what you may have grown up in, to those areas, so that you can see how different they are and things like that, I guess.
Thanks, Kevin. Feel free to continue to share your responses in the chat. I'm going to take one more person and then we're going to move on. Krishna, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it kind of goes along with the map twins from last time and the people actually meeting each other, and the value of not thinking about another area as something that's super different or super far away from what your life is, and just trying to kind of break the barriers between different areas of the city, based on what you see and how things maybe look different.
Absolutely. Thank you, Krishna. Thanks everybody for sharing those different perspectives. We're going to move right into our presentations for the day. So I'm going to pass it over to Mary Weber and Elliot Lewis.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Excited to be here. I'm going to run through a couple slides and then I'm going to hand it over to Elliot and he's going to run through a couple. So the first one is planning related fields. So planning is the combined effort of various areas of work. On the screen here, we have listed just a few planning related fields. In some fields, relationship to urban planning is more obvious, like architecture, geography, or civil engineering, and then others less so, such as psychology or the arts. The great thing about planning is that it provides a lot of flexibility for people with different skill sets, perspectives, and interests to play an active role. This collaboration is a key piece of comprehensive planning because it allows solutions to be formed that take into consideration input from a variety of fields. And I see that Jane added a couple more fields in there as well. Thank you, Jane, for those additions, spot on. So the big picture here is that you don't have to have a traditional urban planning degree to enter the field. People often find creative or unconventional ways into city planning and policymaking work. For example, I have a data science degree. I really like statistics. I focused on that in college, and then I realized that there was a way for me to take those skills and apply them to transportation work, which is how I ended up at CMAP. Oh, very cool. Thanks,
Yeah.
Jane. I had no idea. So on the flip side here, people who study planning sometimes end up doing very different kinds of work. Planning requires a variety of skill sets that are transferable across various lines of work, which makes it a flexible field to go into. It's also common now to enter a planning-related field with a bachelor's degree. In the past, a master's degree was often required, and it makes planning more accessible and allows people to discover at an earlier time in their career what aspects of planning they may or may not enjoy. So before we move to the next slide, I'm going to pause and give you 15, 20 seconds to think in your head how either your field of study or the field of study you're interested in might interact with planning and policy work. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. Perfect, so planner skills. In doing their work, planners develop skills unique to them that when working in a team, help create successful plans and projects. So some people gravitate towards certain areas of planning based on the skills that they bring to this profession. And we've listed just some of those skills on the slide. There's often overlap with these skills, such as working on a visualization or a data analysis and then presenting on that work. So for example, I am currently working with our partners at the Illinois Department of Transportation to help a community close out a transportation project that they did in conjunction with the Regional Transit Authority. And in just that one task alone, there's been quite a bit of data analysis as well as communication. Research is another important skill to planning. That might look like finding information and reading up on it, or collaborating with a subject matter expert. I recently worked with someone on our policy team to help me understand some new legislation being passed that relates to transportation. So I read up on it, still had some questions, and he was able to clarify in a matter of minutes. So while planners' skills vary, and there's room to specialize based on what skills you possess that you most enjoy, there are also many opportunities to learn and improve upon other skills to help make you a well-rounded planner. The type of projects that planners work on have various scopes, which might require the application of skills a planner wouldn't normally use, or even require learning a new skill. It's really a dynamic field, which is one of the reasons that I find it so interesting and engaging. So the big idea here is that there are a variety of skills that assist with planning, and the collaboration of these different skills is how planning gets done successfully. So now's a good time to think about what skills you already have and what you might want to become better at. And now I'm going to hand it over to Elliot for our other slides.
Literally just getting the computer over. Love it. Let me get to my slide here. So thank you, Mary. Again, my name is Elliot, and I'm also an assistant analyst here at CMAP. So if Mary just talked about sort of the how of planning, the skills, the visualization, the analysis, what have you, think of this slide as sort of the what of planning, what people can specialize in. Just as there's a lot of other job fields that are related to planning, planning itself is super diverse. People specialize in where and how people have a place to live, how people and goods get around town, how we can build our future in a way that actually fights climate change. Heck, we even get into law when we try to navigate things like zoning and policy proposals. Folks will work on any or all of these things and more. So take a second and just think of an area that's not listed here that you might consider a planning field or a specialty. Throw your thoughts in the chat. There's a ton of different things that you could think of. And that's the great thing about planning. And a reason I and a lot of people are drawn to it. Is that you get to work with a bunch of different things. You might be working on transportation, but like the modes you choose to plan for will have direct consequences on the local environment, or the land use, the housing, the shops, the schools, the parks. It'll dictate the kinds of modes that will actually work best, or even vice versa. Like I wanted to put like a Venn diagram on this slide to show where the specializations overlap, but it'd mostly be a circle. So many things overlap and intersect and affect one another. But so you probably can't be an expert in everything though. And most people will gravitate towards something. You know, Mary and I both work in transportation, for instance. But you'll be working with a lot of different experts. So I'll tell you right now, if you hate working in group projects, but want to be a planner, learn to at least put up with it. If you can't tell by now, we have to really get to. It's a great experience to be able to work with so many different people who are so good at what they do. And it's humbling too. Go on to the next slide, please. Now, there was one thing on that last slide that I didn't catch, or I didn't talk about, and that was about outreach and engagement. So that's both a specialty and a skill that, you know, most people will do it at least a little bit. And it's an incredibly important aspect of planning that a lot of people dedicate the majority of their time and attention to. It's a skill, honestly, that don't worry if you feel bad talking in front of people. I don't usually like talking in front of people, but it's something that is vitally important. You'll hopefully hear people who are working in planning saying something like, we're not the experts when it comes to the community is. Being a professional planner means you develop those tools and those skills, again, in those certain areas. You know things, how things fit together, how they affect each other in different contexts. But those contexts and the people they affect change from place to place. It might be trying to reach the entire Chicago region during comprehensive planning, like we did with Onto 2050. It can be working with economic development leaders or politicians or public health officials, or it can be something as simple as hanging flyers in a post office, or attending and running design charrettes in church basements with like a dozen people. I've done a public meeting in a town of 100 people and 5 people showed up. 4 of them were on their little board of directors. But it's all still integral to this process. So like, let's take a second and think back to the folded map lessons that you learned. Knowing where you live, knowing where somebody else who their similarities, their differences, the different environments. How can someone's identity and their lived experience shape how they are engaged? How does it shape how you would engage with those people? How are your experiences informing how you actually communicate with people and try to reach them? And please, by all means, keep throwing things in the chat. I see a lot of stuff popping up and it is wonderful. But yeah, public engagement is so much more than just checking off a box on a list of requirements we have to do. It's hard work. So I talked about trying to reach the whole region for the comprehensive planning. Well, when we were going on to 2050, when we were putting it all together, CMAP staff held 10 different forums, like big events, 277 workshops. Get this, over 100,000 different interactions at kiosks, and engaged with almost 5,000 residents. That ain't just checking off a box. That is real hard work that is an amazing thing that I know that I'm not good at. But people like Michelle, people like Courtney, people like Jane, people like a ton of people yeah, there you go, at CMAP are wizards at this. And it's something you could be too. It's a great thing that needs to be done. It's because what this is a chance to involve people in active imagining and crafting of their future, of their lives. There's so much embedded culture, like enmeshed personal and like community memory in a place that you almost certainly can't tell about that place if you're just reading old planning documents or doing data analysis, as important as that is. Yeah, you have the technical skills, but they have and are sort of the collective consciousness of a place, as weird as that might sound. See, the art and science of engagement is reaching people where they are, making them feel welcome and heard, being able to communicate the nuances of a design or a policy to individuals and groups, and honestly, sometimes managing competing views and competing ideas and mediating a little bit of conflict. No one said this process wasn't messy. But effective communication is so vital. Like it says on that slide, it must be intentional and it must be inclusive. Well, if you want to go on to the next slide, that's really enough for me. You guys really don't want to hear me talk. But I'm ecstatic to introduce someone who's actually taught me a ton about the importance of intentionality in planning and design while she had to put up with me for a couple of semesters in class. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Kate Lowe. She studies transportation at the intersection of policy, funding, and mobility justice. Her work examines how varied stakeholders in transportation policies interact across different levels of government and how this impacts transportation investments and racial inequities. She also conducts qualitative research, so not just focusing on the data and the calculations, on lived experiences of mobility and accessibility for low-income populations and Black and Brown communities. Dr. Lowe, she received her PhD in City and Regional Planning from Cornell University in New York, her Master's in Community Development and Planning from Clark University, and a Bachelor's in Cultural Anthropology from Bard College. So Dr. Lowe, thank you, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. Everybody welcome Dr. Lowe.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here, and it is a pleasure to see you, Elliot, and it was a pleasure to have you in class.
She's just saying.
No, you can give me a lie detector test. Thank you for the warm intro. Today, I'm going to be talking about planning, research, and engagement. I'm also happy to talk a little bit about what it means to be in planning situated in a university context. So I think you were okay, you're bringing up my slides now, great. So we've already done the intros and we can move on. Just to let you know what I'll be talking about, I'll give you a brief introduction to CUPA at UIC. Then I'm going to give some examples of quantitative transportation research and planning. That's sometimes what people initially think about when they consider research and analysis. And then I'm going to transition and go into depth on a project that's based here in the city of Chicago to show how qualitative and engaged research can be a complement to the quantitative research as well. So just to let you know about the College of Urban and Planning and Public Affairs at UIC, we have 9 degree programs and 10 research institutes. So I'm based in the Department of Urban Planning and Policy. We have an undergraduate degree in urban studies. We have minors in GIS, sustainable cities. We also have 2 master's programs, one focused on design, one focused on planning, that a lot of local planners have engaged with. We also have a PhD program. We also have programs in public administration. As I just heard the presenters talk about, there is a lot of overlap. Not everyone who's a planner did the planning degree route. And there's a lot of complementarity in between the 2 fields. And then we have a lot of exciting research centers. I'm affiliated with the Government Finance Research Center because I'm really interested in the rules of the game in terms of how funding affects transportation decisions. I'm also affiliated with the Urban Transportation Center, but there's a lot of other exciting work that engages in communities and creates locally specific knowledge as well as knowledge that's transferable across the state and region. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have about CUPPA, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of that background. And I chose to do the academic route because I really like reading, writing, and research, but I also absolutely love engagement, advocacy, and teaching. And academia can be a pivot point where you can combine a lot of different activities. And as it sounds like you're already well aware, planning brings together a lot of different fields. So I focus on transportation, but I'm not interested in transportation in isolation. I'm interested in how it connects with a lot of different issues. Okay, and now we can transition over. I have a blank slide and then we can transition into a picture. So I'm going to give a couple examples of quantitative research that started from me seeing problems or people in my social network or professional network seeing problems. This is New Orleans, Louisiana. This is what unfortunately too many bus stops look like. We have a sidewalk to nowhere, sidewalk that just ends, that is not connected. It's really hard to walk safely without a continuous sidewalk. There are, of course, places like this in Chicagoland as well, and CMAP actually has a sidewalk inventory of where there are and are not sidewalks. In this particular case in New Orleans, the walking conditions are pretty atrocious, just the sidewalk infrastructure aspect, not to mention all the other social and built environment aspects of walkability. So in this research, starting from seeing this kind of problem, you can go to the next slide. We were able, oh, this is post-Katrina. We were able to utilize an existing data set that the Regional Transit Authority, there's an RTA there as well. They did a study of all their bus stops. It's primarily a bus system with some streetcars. And so each one of these dots represents a bus stop. An orange dot represents a place where there was not a continuous sidewalk between the bus stop and the next intersection. So places where sidewalk walkability was horrible and therefore also transit access. So the first step was this GIS analysis that used RTA data and then census data. And we can see this map represents the share of population that it identifies as people of color. So the darker sections represent higher concentrations of Black and brown residents. And some patterns might pop out at you right away, as we see in Eastern New Orleans, a lot of missing sidewalks, but not exclusively so. So visualization can be an important part of the research process, an important planning skill set. But we took this visualization a step further. We use GIS and spatial joins to do research analysis in a statistical program. You can bring up the next slide. So we use SPSS, which is a statistical software, although it is old at this point, not probably the statistical software you all will learn. And we looked at correlation coefficients. That means what is the relation with the increase in the share of white population, what happens to the frequency of missing sidewalks. So a positive correlation means the two variables increase together. A negative correlation means as one variable goes up, the other goes down. And statistical significance is a very complicated concept that I'm not going to detail today. But the statistical significance means we can be fairly confident it is more than just chance. And so our statistical analysis showed there was a statistically significant relationship between the racial composition of a census tract and missing sidewalks. So this is powerful analysis that brings to light problems that planners need to attend to, and one example of what research can do in documenting planning. And we can go to the next slide. We're going to pivot to a more local example of quantitative research. This may look familiar to some of you if you've ever gone to an emissions testing station. But this research came up when the subcontractor who manages emissions testing closed all the testing stations in the city of Chicago. So some other folks, including the Voorhees Center within CUPPA, and some other folks said, whoa, at face value, this seems really unfair. Let's understand what the impacts are. What is the additional miles traveled, travel time, and what is the relative burden by race and income in traveling to these sites? So we can go to the next slide. That we mapped out the racial composition. We focused on 2 analyses, both the city of Chicago as well as the larger region. And the map shows open sites that are closest to the city as well as the sites that were closed. Oh, thank you for catching some of my shorthand. I don't always know the background you've had, and I appreciate the chat box clarifying that. And when we move to questions and answers, I'm happy to clarify as well. And then the next slide shows poverty rates and the sites as well. So we use geographic information systems, a network analyst tool. My collaborator did a lot of that technical analysis, and we got administrative records through Freedom of Information Act request. And then you can go to the next slide. And we found with the closing of those 2 facilities, there would be an additional 1.9 million miles traveled. So emissions testing is to make air quality better, but the closures resulted in more miles traveled, as well as time traveled, 45,000 hours. And that's over a 2-year testing cycle. We also were really interested in how the distribution of testing sites affects different racial and ethnic groups differently. And one of the limitations of aggregate data is not every Black resident lives in a majority Black neighborhood, and in a majority Black neighborhood, not every resident is Black. So there's a lot of diversity, even in these big patterns we see. But what we found is in census we did zip code analysis because that's the scale at that the administrative records were at. What we found is there was a statistically significant difference in the amount of travel time and distance for areas that had high poverty levels and high concentrations of people of color. And what we found after the closures, the difference decreased. Is this a good thing? Actually not, because instead of improving conditions for low income and Black and brown communities, conditions just got worse for everybody. So that's part of our bigger argument, is that we have to look at historic trends, not just current trends, to understand the landscape. So those are 2 quick examples of quantitative research that we did based on researchers' ideas and frameworks. But now I'm going to transition into some other collaborative work. These studies relied on government and census data. But with Equiticity, which is an advocacy organization, and the Metropolitan Planning Council, we wanted to understand how, you can go back a slide. I jumped ahead a little bit. We wanted to couple the powerful mapping and quantitative tools we have with hearing directly from Black and brown job seekers who are experiencing difficulties. So this is a map that is based on a tool that one of my colleagues at UIC made. It's the urban accessibility mapper, and the darker green means more access to jobs by transit. There's more job access via transit on the north side and near the L in Chicago. So this kind of bird's eye level view tells us about inequities, but it doesn't tell us what it's like to live in those experiences. And so this phase of research, talking to folks, wasn't about solving things specifically. It was about, are we even looking at the right problem? And it was funded by the Chicago Community Trust. And I know that you are all from across the region. So I'm just gonna zoom in. If you go 2 slides, we can see the racial dot density map of Chicago. This particular study just focused on sites within Chicago. As Elliot was discussing, regional scale picture requires more resources, time, and analysis. There's a lot of variability within the region. But as you might know, the city of Chicago has a population of 2.7 million residents. It's almost 33% non-Latinx white, 30% non-Latinx Black, 29% Latinx, 6% Asian, and 2% other races or ethnicities. It's a highly segregated city and region. And as some of you might know, there's large concentrations of Black residents on the south side, Latinx residents on the southwest, west side, and to some extent on the northwest side. And of course, the city and region both are rife with inequities. Unemployment rates, for example, are unequal by race, and it's not just a factor of education. Black unemployment rates are Black Chicagoans with graduate professional degrees have higher rates of unemployment than white residents with 4-year degrees. So it is not just education. And the average commute time difference aggregates to an additional work week of commute time for Black residents on average. And of course, that's an average. So there's going to be Black residents with quicker commutes and white residents with longer commutes. Okay. And like residential segregation, there's geographic segregation as well. So this is some census data background. We're not into the qualitative work yet. You can go to the next slide. This is also census data. It's just to show that there are racial trends among transit use and active modes. The bus is disproportionately used by Black and brown residents, even though thousands use the L and vice versa. And probably many of you know, bus service on average in the region is a lot slower than the L or Metro. Buses can actually have high quality service in something called bus rapid transit, like the Loop Link downtown, where the bus has its own lane, but that's not the story for most bus service. Okay, so that's background for this study. Now I'm going to move into data collection. So we worked in partnership with the Chicago Cook Workforce Partnership and held focus groups at their job centers in the city of Chicago. We talked to job coaches and we talked to 82 job seekers. So we weren't trying to say we know about every single experience in the region, but we wanted to get a cross section. Focus groups averaged around 8 participants. We had high representation of women, Black job seekers, and those without a college degree. Women, and we can go to the next slide. The next slide shows the geographic distribution of the residents by zip code, and the blue dots are where we had the focus groups. And we recorded the focus groups and transcribed them. You can go to the next slide. There's just a racial breakdown of the respondents. And the next slide. I'm going to talk a minute about how we can do engaged research systematically. So most of our findings were not numbers. They were themes and quotes, but there are tools and approaches to use that make qualitative and focus group conversations systematic research. So we recorded and transcribed all of these, and then there was a team of us that all read all the transcriptions. And we used the data from those focus groups to create categories based on our conversations with job seekers and job coaches. Some of them overlapped. But by doing this kind of coding, instead of our predetermined categories, we let their voices shape how we did the analysis. We read the transcriptions, created categories, and then stellar RA, Chelsea Corrin, who's actually the first author of the report, went through and line by line coded all the transcriptions. Then we used the software program to query every time a code came up, and then we wrote based on that. And at the end, I'll put a link to the report. So we don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to go quickly through some of the key findings. So the next slide is a quote that talks about how much time is spent commuting. So we look at averages, and sometimes we look at interactive maps about how long it might take to get somewhere. Well, the lived experience is that commuting takes a lot longer. So this respondent talked about putting in an hour and a half, a minimum, and how time burden it was, because there are high concentrations of jobs in the suburbs that are higher quality. Even though workers lived in the city of Chicago, they were doing complicated reverse commutes to the suburbs. We heard a lot about improvements that respondents wanted to transit. There are serious problems from cleanliness, and this is pre-COVID, ease of transfers, fare payment, reliability, maintenance of elevators, information, and security. I'll get to that later. So enhancements are critical, but more funding for transit is required to make these enhancements, along with partnerships to address contextual factors that transit agencies don't directly control. And then you can go to the next slide. So we included questions about biking and walking in our survey instrument, but other than our questions, respondents didn't bring up biking and walking a lot. But we heard a lot about the dangers of each mode. Oh, if you can go back to the bike slide. So with biking, we heard a lot about traffic dangers. So you can see I pulled up an image from Archer Avenue, where the zoomed in picture shows there's a bike rack, but the bike rack makes only a marginal improvement to that landscape of a busy roadway for biking. And danger from violence came up frequently as a barrier to walking, as well as just the total distance of destination sites. So that leads to the next major theme of security. This person talked about how they can afford to drive, but they saw shootings, and because of that, they went ahead and made the financial decision to buy a vehicle because of their safety concerns. And what is different from the biking and walking questions is we didn't have any questions related to security in our instrument. This is something respondents brought up in every focus group, and this type of research allows space for people living certain experiences to bring up issues you might not have thought of. These findings mean if we're analyzing walkability just based on the sidewalk inventory, or we're analyzing transit based just on transit models, we're going to overestimate lived experiences of accessibility because of this. And while many of us know that automobile use has serious trade-offs in terms of traffic crashes and environmental impacts, many saw this as a needed adaptation for the landscape they were facing. And in addition to mode shift, you can go to the next slide. This person is talking about their experience on transit, and they saw a fight. And so not only do we lose transit and walking trips to violence concerns, people are also stressed out by it. And I want to be very clear that this collective project did not recommend increased policing given the documented racism in it and the criminal justice system. This was a workforce mobility study, so we didn't outline specific steps on security, but we instead recognize the need to collaborate with community-based groups and social justice movements that are leading socially and racially just transformation work to address the root causes of violence. Okay, next slide. And there's a theme that came up a lot about not having quality jobs in close proximity. So there's a big travel burden. This graphic is from a tool called On the Map. So we argue there's multiple potential benefits, including but not limited to job access from the development of quality jobs on the southwest sides and support of existing businesses and new businesses. We envision a scenario in which a suburban commute is a choice rather than a necessity for city residents in order to get quality jobs. And if we hadn't talked to respondents, we might have just focused on transit solutions instead of thinking about it this way. The next slide. And as Elliot was and others were talking about, residents are experts. We talk to people who are very acutely knowledgeable and perceptive of the inequities. This quote talks about the trains and buses on the north side versus the south side, and this idea that we all use the system and we all need it to be reliable. So with that, the next slide, we also heard about the role of employers. We heard that employers sometimes say, do you have reliable transport? And then screen out individuals who use transit. So there's a transportation hiring bias as well. And participants suggested solutions with benefits that would bring employers closer to employees or to better transportation hubs, or coordinate schedules better with transit. So the next slide, please. So overall, respondents identified transportation barriers that reflect long-standing and equitable investments and policies that have created and continue to create barriers to employment, especially but not exclusively on the south and west side. And they had ideas for solutions as well. One called for reparations, and many wanted better quality jobs in close proximity. That's why we argue that addressing transportation challenges can and must involve non-transportation solutions, even as transportation improvements are certainly vital. And this is an important contribution that transportation agencies need to hear and need to partner with other entities. And with the last slide, I just want to highlight this idea. This is a slide from the Untokening, that qualitative work and engagement can value community voices as essential data, geographic information systems, numerical analysis, and a whole host of tools are important tools in the planner's toolbox, but so is engaged research that treats voices and perspectives as important inputs as well. So that's where I was going to close out. The next slide has a link to where this report and some related reports are based. And feel free to direct message me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is right there. And I think that the next phase was going to open it up to questions.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Lowe. I think your research is incredibly interesting. I was just thinking about the quotes you received from the people you interviewed, and even CMAP is actually working on a mobility recovery project in which we're thinking about ways to make transportation more accessible across the region. So we do have 10 minutes for questions. So I'm going to ask students to either ask questions in the chat. I see folks were using the raise your hand feature earlier. I love that. You're welcome to use that. But we really want to open up this time for you to ask questions. Also, if there's anything you want Dr. Lowe to clarify, this is a great time to ask.
And I'm happy to talk not just about the examples I gave you, but about research more generally, UIC or my professional trajectory and how I ended where I am.
Okay, we're looking at the chat. I guess, well, while questions come in, we have one from Kevin. What made you interested in researching this topic?
Well, each one was a little different. I mean, more broadly, I got really interested in transit inequities because of living in Boston and seeing a rail line torn down and then promises never delivered to have replacement service. And that was actually not quite 20 years ago, but getting close to 20 years ago. And that really made me interested, as well as seeing how at different transit stations, there was really different racial demographics of how residential neighborhoods were segregated, and understanding transit as a lens to think about social justice questions, as well as my time as a union organizer really made me interested in social justice, but transit became a way of pulling that to tangible topics. And in terms of the qualitative study, that was something that Equiticity, MPC, and I all wanted to do as part of our broader work around transportation equity, is hearing the voices of Black and Brown folks and whether the quantitative data and tools align. Okay. The next question is the best public transit. Oh, geez. There's lots of ways to count it. In the United States, New York City has the biggest transit system. And New York City, in many studies, is excluded as an outlier because New York City is so different than so many cities in the United States. So New York City has the most extensive, but it depends on how we define best. Do we mean most equitable? Do we mean most used? Do we mean most bus service? Do we mean best in terms of the best access for those with disabilities? Because a lot of older systems don't have good access for those with disabilities. So I'm gonna be a politician, a stereotype, and not directly answer the question, and just say New York City has the most extensive system, and lots of transit agencies have different assets and downsides. How would specializing in nonprofit management connect to urban planning? I might actually toss that question back to, well, nonprofit, a lot of entities that engage in community development issues such as affordable housing or small business development. A lot of those entities are nonprofits, so having skills in nonprofit management might help if you went that direction. But that's not the only intersection, that's just the first one I thought of. Lena is asking what a typical work day looks like for me. So I have one thing I like about being a professor is that it is not a typical job in the amount of freedom I have. I'm just going to be honest. I get to make my own schedule, and my class schedule is set by the departments, and I have a lot of meetings with the departments, but I get to structure my own day as long as I deliver in terms of research, service, and teaching. So sometimes I will start off with correspondence, do some academic reading, do some writing, do some grading. It's a large mix, and it's a career path with a lot of flexibility, and I'm very fortunate in that regard. Dominique is asking about higher ridership of people of color experience in buses, including transit. That's actually a really big question, but one of the answers is because this nationally, there's been a lot of investment in rail to serve affluent and white communities, so a lot of public sector choices. But there's also There's housing costs. Some housing that's near the L is more expensive, so there's housing cost differences as well as public sector choices that have often prioritized speed for more affluent populations. I actually just did a white paper on transit equity. Let's see how quickly I can bring it up, because it answers some of those questions nationally.
Great. And seeing there are a few more questions in the chat, but for the sake of time, we may be only able to get to one or two more questions. But I love how engaged students are. Clearly, they're interested in what you've researched, Dr. Lowe. So we greatly appreciate you sharing those additional resources.
Looks like we might have some future planners
Yes.
too.
I hope so. Okay.
So we have a question here from Vinny. As a researcher, do you prefer qualitative research or quantitative research? Do decision makers have a preference on the two from those that you have come across?
So there's quantitative data gets a lot of weight in decision making because you can map it, you can graph it. Sometimes people want a clear answer. A lot of times qualitative findings are more hazy. They're more, they're hard to communicate. They add important nuance. And some policymakers respond well to individual stories. So hearing individual quotes can be powerful, but I would say quantitative gets a lot of traction. I personally prefer qualitative, but I still really, you can see from my presentation when I was giving you the background to our study, I presented some quantitative data. So I still really rely on quantitative data.
And I think we'll end off with this question, Dr. Lowe. This is from Krishna. What were some ways you engaged community residents and cultivated participation for the studies you did?
So the one I presented on, we partnered with workforce centers and directly reached out to respondents. For the related study that you can see if you go to that link I shared, we worked with existing organizations that have relationships. And so they already had relationships with constituents. And should we get more funding, we'd like to do some more deep extended engagement, but it takes it takes resources. So that's something that we definitely want to do. But I think that's also something good for planners to think about is what are existing entities that already have relationships and how can you work with them? Although I see someone ask about unrepresentative engagement and the public, it's important to know if you're hearing all the voices or just the loudest voices. But partnering with community organizations can be a great way for planners to amplify and elevate the important work that already is happening in many communities.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Lowe. Again, we appreciate your time and the resources you've shared with us. You are welcome to, I think you provided us with your email. Was that on that last slide?
Yeah, I'll put my email address and on my Twitter handle.
Great.
And everyone is welcome to reach out.
Wonderful. Again, thank you so much. So what we'll do now is we're actually going to go into breakout rooms. So there'll be 4 breakout rooms, and each breakout room will be led by a facilitator. So there are a few questions we want you all to reflect on, what you've learned from this presentation and in general about today's session. So we're going to have Courtney put us in breakout rooms, and I'm going to ask you 2 or 3 students to share what they learned from the breakout room when we come back. Dr. Lowe, you're welcome to stay or head out, but if you want to hear what students are saying in the breakout rooms, but otherwise, thank you again for your time.
I'd love to hear an overview from you after you're done, but I'm going to step out to work on reviewing PhD students' research design. So,
Wow. Best of luck.
I'm fortunate to be in a field I love. So hopefully I'll meet some of you in other contexts and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
So I've just posted the questions for the breakout room reflection in the chat, and I am going to start the breakout rooms. Hello, everybody. Sorry for the delay. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Cool. So you all should have gotten the questions. So I'll start off with how do you, thinking about like so far the last session, this session, learning about segregation in Chicago and like, you know, urban planning in general and how it can connect to so many different fields. How do you think urban planning has affected your particular neighborhood?
The public transit where I live is
And feel free
not.
to jump right in, no need to raise hands or anything, just jump right in.
Well, I guess more affecting my town because when at the beginning of this year, when the Biden administration released a plan for Amtrak, it turns out that my town is going to be getting served by Amtrak, which, you know, I didn't expect. Our train line isn't very busy. It's like 1 or 2 freight trains a day, mostly at night. And I guess I can connect that to, you know, what we learned today with you know, talking about public transit and yeah, Huntley has been growing since the 90s, but before then it was just a small farming town.
So do you think that with this new Amtrak station kind of coming in and more freight coming in, your area is going to grow? You got more people coming in. They're trying to bring more businesses, more people to the area.
I think it will definitely contribute. I mean, the town's been growing a lot anyways.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we got a hospital recently, which was helpful. For my spring break, that's another story, but it was nice to have it nearby. They're building up more businesses close to I-90 as well.
Okay.
And in my neighborhood, it's kind of your stereotypical. They do like maybe 5 or 10 different house designs and then just like build it in, you know, like a grid pattern. But I think getting Amtrak, if nothing else, it will be another way to get into downtown Chicago, which is nice because currently you either have to drive to another town to get on Metra or drive on the interstate.
Thanks for sharing, Ben. Does anyone else want to share?
In my town, if you don't have a car, you can't get anywhere. There are no buses and the Metro hardly ever stops. So if you want to get somewhere, the odds are you have to like, the metro only comes like 2 hours before whatever time it is you need to be downtown. So that's at the very least an absolute pain and an incredible disadvantage.
I mean, so I live in northwest side of Chicago, and so I do have access to like the CTA, L trains, Blue Line in particular. But I mean, relatively in our neighborhood, at least in my neighborhood, you have access to the Blue Line, you have access to the Purple Line, you have access to the Red Line, Brown Line. But like, so like when I was looking at the Folded Maps project, I was looking at the place on the, Stickney, Central Stickney. There's no direct real access to, I think it was the Orange Line that was the closest, and albeit it's right next to Midway as well. But I mean, the south side of Chicago is a huge population, a huge area. And in comparison to the northwest side, you have like 5 trains that you can take one bus and get onto all of them. But on the south side, you get one train that will take you to the Orange Line. That's supposed to help the entire southwest side of Chicago, which just doesn't make a lot of sense, at the very least.
And kind of going off of that, I've said it a bunch of times, like 119th, and it's like a bunch of buses that go in this area, but there's not really a train that goes in this area. And it ends at 95th, even though like there's a whole 30-block radius that's being neglected by the train. And you have like Skokie and Evanston that have the yellow line and the purple line, but none of that is here.
That's a good point, Kennedy. I am familiar with that area because I have family that live in that area, and I'm not really from that area, but I always say that I am because I have the family there. But I am familiar with like the 95th Street Red Line, the 95th Street stop that's there. And if any of you all have ever been there, for those of you who haven't, there's a huge bus terminal at that station. Because the train stops there. And like Kennedy said, there's so many neighborhoods that are neglected. And so all of these bus stops pretty much serve it. And so, say for instance, if there's, just like in some of the research that Dr. Lowe presented, if you have, a working single mother or whatever who is working multiple jobs and her mode of transportation is public transit, and she say for instance has to take the train to 95th Street and then take a bus then to 100 and whatever street, it may take a long time, because if it's late at night, let's say like 10 o'clock, the buses, we all know, no matter where you live, sometimes the buses run at like very lengthy periods. And so her having to what should be maybe a hour commute may turn into a 2-hour or 3-hour commute. So it definitely affects so many different people across the city and suburbs. Ben, even like you said, coming from that specific area, having people think about the people who don't have cars that need to get to that stop to take the Metro or Amtrak into the city. What about public engagement? Why is public engagement so important in this process?
It's ultimately because if you're, if you want to develop an area, you have to, take into consideration the people that are actually going to live there. It's a recurring problem that I see in my city whenever I go to like the city council meetings, that there's always like a population of people who, complain that they didn't hear about what the city's been doing, and then they show up because there's been a development that they don't like to see. So it's important, to make sure that everybody knows and that you're doing your very best to make sure that the public is aware that the development is going to go on. But I guess the onus is also on the people who live there to try and be informed, so that it's not an issue of like, oh, I didn't hear about this, and then something's happening and you didn't know.
It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to like plan projects in certain areas and not speak to the people who already live there. Like,
in some of my political work, a lot of this comes down to money and who has it. So you need to get to put it bluntly, the community to pressure and or bully the politicians and the people who have the money to spend it in a way that actually benefits the community. And this being Chicago, yeah, you need a lot of community support to actually get people to listen.
That's so true, you guys. Thank you for sharing that. We have just literally a few more seconds and we'll have a 60-second countdown. Does anyone else want to share who hasn't spoken yet about maybe just public engagement?
I don't have anything with public engagement, but like kind of opposite to what Ben said. This was about the first question, how does planning affect your neighborhood? So I live in Naperville, which is the largest city that Metro serves for commuters. And Metro now has gone back to like basically a normal schedule starting last week, but basically none of the bus services are running. So my dad has to ride his bike and like we only own one car. So yeah, he's having to ride his bike instead of having that bus service that was previously available. And we also but we tore down buildings to make more parking spaces. And I think we should expand bus service instead of having people drive. We also need more bike lanes as well.
Good point, Seth.
Oh, hi, everybody. We are, I think everyone's back in. Just double check. Yes. So we had a really interesting discussion in our breakout room, but we want to open it up for students to share some of the topics they covered in their reflection room and maybe any thoughts you had. So feel free to use the raise your hand feature. So I actually would like students to unmute themselves and share. The chat, it can be used as well, but we would love to hear your voices. So I'm gonna check and see. Okay, we have, yes, Kevin, please unmute yourself and share.
So in our breakout room, we talked a lot about what kind of what interested us the most in urban planning and what kind of career path we were thinking of going into. And a lot of us were thinking either equity or the policy of urban planning.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin. I'm going to actually invite Lena from my group to share because she kind of got cut off when we were returning back to the breakout room or to the main room. So Lena, I'm going to ask you to share.
Okay, so we were talking about the availability of equity and how to get, how to reach other people or just people and making sure that you're hitting and checking all the boxes. So I was talking about how I live in the 19th ward and there's some sort of board between wards and districts and that sort of thing. And that by getting a more diverse board and by checking all those boxes and listening to everyone's voice, that will definitely have a better outreach for communication between all different types of people.
Great. Thank you, Lena. Such a great point. I'm not seeing any other hands raised. I'm wondering if folks want to add comments to the chat, but
Prescott raised.
Oh, I see Prescott. Thank you. Prescott, please unmute yourself and share.
I felt like one of the, I had a big, when I just got discussed it in the breakout rooms, one of the biggest emphases that I had was that there should be plenty of ways to get the public involved, and you should make an effort that governing bodies and developers should make an effort to try and include as many outreaches to the community as possible, because otherwise decisions are made and ordinances are put in place that end up ostracizing individuals who might bring a lot of monetary gain and, active workforce members to a community, and people who could bring sanitation efforts and a lot of different positive reinforcements of upholding a community, but instead they're shut out because their lifestyles aren't approved of or aren't supported by city ordinance codes, and it's harder for them to find a place to live that isn't in some deserted corner of the community with extremely inflated rent prices, or they can't room with their pets or with their friends. It's just people who try and cherry pick those ordinances in order to make it harder for people to move in who don't suit the status quo.
Great. Thank you, Prescott. Will?
Yeah, going off of actually some of Prescott's comments, so I talked about my hometown is Lake Zurich, and in the same vein that policy blocks out a lot of people from living in different communities, in Lake Zurich, our issue right now is housing value. And I think a lot of suburbs can say the same thing. If we want to call it post-COVID, housing values have skyrocketed. And for people who have the ability, the money, the privilege to do so, they have moved from cities to suburbs, for a very varying reasons, better schools, better access to shopping and all that good stuff. So in Lake Zurich, our housing values are insane. And I personally have witnessed that blocks out a lot of, ability for people to move there. And yes, our schools are great, but our schools are not accessible to everyone who wants good education. Our schools are good because our property taxes are high. And so as a result, these higher home values feed into paying for better services. And that's the cyclical effect that you see in places like Southside Chicago, where not having enough residential properties on the tax roll doesn't give enough, funding to the services that Southside residents need or that everyone needs. And so, high housing values are a big one where I live right now.
Great comment, Will. Really great comment. Allie?
I was just going to kind of add on to that because I go to school in Naperville, and same thing as like Zurich, like property values are already really high there. And as they continue to make downtown nicer, and they're adding all these things constantly, but it's making affordable housing go away that was barely already there. So it's really hard for different groups and people that don't own a property there now to get in. That's a problem that we're seeing. Another thing that someone in my group mentioned about Naperville is just that it is like a commuter suburb, and they focus a lot on driving, and we don't have bike lanes and very good bus service compared to other suburbs. So that's another problem that they have.
We're going to hear from Erin.
So in our group, we also talked a lot about the trains, who has access to what lines, and the Metra and how slowly it runs. And I just really wanted to quickly mention, because I just found this out yesterday and I thought it was pretty cool. The Cook County Treasurer's Office has 20 years worth of data on property values, as well as how it breaks down by demographic. So if you have some time and are also a giant data nerd, I highly recommend it.
I'm going to turn it to the chat real quick, and I'm going to ask Dominique to expand on the comment she made about inclusive language and the importance of it. Dominique, would you mind unmuting and sharing that comment?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I said in the chat was being inclusive with language is really important, making sure that policy proposals and other forms of communication and planning are understandable to the general public, as well as ensuring that you provide multiple translations to reach as many people as possible, because the United States does not have an official language. We speak over 300 languages in the States alone. So making sure that we can reach, immigrants and a wide variety of people is really important, but also making sure that the people that we are reaching really understand the things that we're trying to do is important as well. Making sure that we're not using excessive jargon to try and like smart up our language, so that anyone that reads it can understand this is what we're doing, this is how and why we're doing it is really important.
Thank you, Dominique. Really great point. We can take one more comment and then we'll transition to actually our closing, which will be just a slide on the homework assignment. Any last comments? Ali, did you want to make a comment, or was that from earlier?
Yeah, I was just going to add on really quick to what Dominique was saying. I study environmental science, and we often see this when they want to put in maybe a landfill or something, and they have to pass out like forms or like tell the residents that this is going to be happening. But a lot of times they will play it up, make it really hard to understand, won't even give it in the right languages a lot of the time. So that's a big environmental injustice that has to do with planning that we're seeing happen right now as well.
Thank you, Ali. I do want to add that you all have made some really thoughtful comments. It makes me really excited about the future of urban planning, should you all choose to be urban planners. But the fact that you're having these thoughts, these questions, definitely shows that this is something that's important to you. So we definitely want to make sure we're equitable in the planning process, and we're ensuring that the right voices are being heard. So thank you all for your comments in the chat and for unmuting yourself and sharing. So our last slide for today is actually the homework assignment, which is available on the engagement page. So we want you to identify an issue in your community. So we've already had these conversations in the reflection, but think about one issue in your community. And we want you to interview one person about their ideas to address it or improve it. So identify the issue and then find someone to interview about that. So some questions to consider may include, is public transportation accessible in the community? Should there be more sidewalks or bike lanes? Is this area affordable? If not, what should we do to incorporate more affordable housing in our area? Where can public art go? And then finally, last two questions, how can this area be improved to better withstand climate change? And if safety is a concern, what are some ways we can make this area safer? So again, this is already up on the engagement page. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Courtney. But we are closing out for the day. So we just thank you all for joining us for our second session. And Courtney actually has a quick announcement before we close out.
So Yuyan just posted the instructions to the homework assignment and a link to it in the chat. You all also should have received emails. So we do send out weekly emails on Tuesdays and Wednesdays with the information for the engagement page, your homework assignment, and then any pre-session content to check out before the session. Make sure you check your email, check your spam to make sure you're prepared for next week's session. The other thing I'll announce too is that we have a field trip. So the field trip will be next Saturday, July 24th. We're gonna meet at CMAP's offices between 10 and 10:30, 10:15, 10:30. And then we'll leave from the offices, and then we're gonna take the train together and head down to Washington Park for a tour. This is in conjunction with a project that CMAP is working on called the Green Line South Project. So if you are interested and you do want to attend, please get your waivers in. If you do not have the waivers, we did not get the email, contact Michelle or I, or contact the Flip email. We said get them in by July 23rd, but if you can get them in sooner, that would be great, so we can get a head count of everybody and start making additional preparations for the field trip. Any other questions about the field trip or any sessions, feel free to reach out to us. Other than that, thank you again for tuning in to this week's session, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I'm leaving. Thank you,